You believe you know where the next wars will be fought. You think of Taiwan, the South China Sea, direct confrontations between superpowers. But while the world watches those obvious flashpoints, China is quietly conquering something far more valuable. And by the time you realize it, it will be too late to stop it. Everything you've learned about military strategy is outdated. Because modern wars don't start with invasions. They start with airports, ports, cell towers, bank loans. They start with things so mundane that no one pays attention until suddenly there's no way back. In 2024, China fired a ballistic missile from Hainan that landed in the economic waters of Kiribati, a nation of atolls in the middle of the Pacific that most people couldn't even find on a map. Weeks later, Chinese warships conducted live-fire exercises in the Tasmanian Sea between Australia and New Zealand, forcing more than 50 commercial flights to divert. And then they circumnavigated Australia for the first time in history. The world reacted with brief alarm, headlines for a few days, and then silence. Because no one realized what was really happening. These weren't random drills, they were demonstrations of control. China isn't building military bases in the Pacific, at least not officially. It's doing something much smarter, something you only notice when it's already permanent. It's building what military experts call dual-use strategic nodes, infrastructure that looks civilian but can become military at any moment. And while the United States spends trillions on aircraft carriers and fifth-generation fighters, China is simply building ports, airports, cell towers. Why? Because it understands a fundamental principle of geopolitical control that few can see. You don't need to invade a country if you control its infrastructure. To understand China's plan, you need to grasp the psychology of silent power. Traditional power is visible. It's tanks, soldiers, military bases with flags waving.
And precisely because it's visible, it creates resistance, opposition, alliances against you. But what if you could exercise the same control without anyone realizing they're being controlled? That's where the genius of China's Pacific Plan comes in. Since 2006, China has invested roughly $3.5 billion in at least 50 strategic infrastructure projects across 12 Pacific Island nations. We're not talking about humanitarian aid. We're talking about systematic construction of airports, deep-water seaports, fiber optic networks, and energy systems in locations with obvious military value. And here's the devastating psychological trick. Everything looks benign. A port in Vanuatu, it's for trade. A modernized airport in Papua New Guinea, economic development. Huawei cell towers in the Solomon Islands, digital connectivity. But when you analyze where these projects are being built and who is building them, a pattern emerges. The companies behind these projects aren't ordinary contractors. They're China Communications Construction Company, the same firm that built China's artificial military islands in the South China Sea. China Railway Engineering Corporation, Sinhydro. All of them grew out of China's Ministry of Railways and have deep ties to the People's Liberation Army. In other words, China is building military infrastructure disguised as development aid, and the host countries are paying for it with Chinese loans. This is debt-trap diplomacy turned into military strategy. Let me show you exactly how it works in practice. April 2022, the Solomon Islands, a strategic archipelago between Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu that hosted crucial American naval and air bases during World War II, signs a secret security pact with China. The agreement, never made fully public, allows China to send police and military forces to maintain social order and protect lives and property in the Solomons. More importantly, it allows Chinese warships to dock, refuel, and service at Solomon ports.
When the news leaked, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States panicked. They sent emergency delegations, offered counter deals, tried to stop it. Too late, the deal was already signed. But here's what makes it psychologically brilliant. Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare vehemently denied that it was a Chinese military base. He said, "We're just diversifying our security partners." And technically, he was right. It's not a base. Yet. It's something far more effective. It's access. It's precedent. It's the door opening a few inches at a time until one day it's wide open and no one remembers when that happened. And the pattern repeats across the Pacific. In Kiribati, that remote nation where China fired its missile, there's a 2,000-meter runway that once served as a critical U.S. supply hub during World War II. It's only 2,900 kilometers from Hawaii. China has already expressed interest in modernizing that airstrip. With its own money, of course. In Papua New Guinea, China built upgrades to Mamoti Airport, near Manus Deepwater Port, used by U.S. naval ships. Now China has a presence to monitor and potentially disrupt U.S. operations. In Vanuatu, China financed a $97 million port project in Bougainville, conveniently the site of one of the largest American naval bases in the Pacific during World War II. And in October 2024, two Chinese destroyers, Type 055 and Type 052D, the most advanced in China's Navy, docked at Port Vila, Vanuatu's capital. The first time ships of that size ever reached the South Pacific. See the pattern? China isn't just building random infrastructure. It's recreating the network of bases the United States used to win World War II, only this time on the other side. But here's the revelation that makes this story truly disturbing. The United States knows all of this. It has for years. In 2021, American intelligence identified China's Pacific strategy. They documented the investments, mapped the strategic nodes,
Warned allies, and then did almost nothing. You know how much the U.S. sent in aid to Kiribati in 2023? $20,000. In 2004, it was $1.3 million. Meanwhile, China maintains a fully equipped embassy in Kiribati. The nearest American diplomat is over 2,000 kilometers away, in Fiji. Why? Because in the American mindset, the Pacific is safe. It's the American lake, as President Eisenhower declared in 1954. And that collective arrogance, that belief in permanent dominance, is exactly what China is exploiting. Because while the U.S. treats the Pacific as guaranteed, China treats each island as a geopolitical battlefield to be won, inch by inch. And there's a deep psychological reason this works so well. Small Pacific Island nations don't want to be pawns in great power games. But when one power offers real money, tangible infrastructure, and constant diplomatic attention, and the other offers empty promises and neglect, the choice becomes obvious. China isn't bribing these nations, it's filling a vacuum the United States created through indifference. And the most devastating part is, many of these countries genuinely need help. They face climate change, fragile economies, crumbling infrastructure. When China shows up with $100 million to build a port or modernize an airport, it doesn't matter if there are strings attached. It's more than anyone else is offering. That's the psychological mechanism of soft power turned into strategic control. You don't dominate, you become indispensable. And now we reach the part the United States really doesn't want you to understand. This isn't just about influence in the Pacific, it's about Taiwan. Every strategic node China builds in the South Pacific is a piece on a much larger chessboard, and the ultimate goal is to completely encircle Taiwan, not just from the Chinese side, but from all sides. Look at the map. Taiwan sits in the so-called first island chain, the line that runs from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines and Malaysia. If China controls only that line, it already traps Taiwan. But now it's pushing into the second island chain, which includes Guam, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomons, and even the third chain, Hawaii and beyond. Why? Because if the US tries to defend Taiwan, it will need secure supply routes across the Pacific. It will need bases, ports, refueling. And China is systematically denying access to all of it. In August 2022, the Solomon Islands denied entry to a US Coast Guard ship and a British Navy vessel, citing a moratorium on foreign military ships. Chinese ships? Welcome anytime. That's not coincidence, it's strategy. China is creating what military strategists call an anti-access area denial zone, not just around Taiwan, but across the entire western and southern Pacific. And when the critical moment comes, if China decides to move on Taiwan, the US will find its reinforcement routes blocked, its potential bases hostile, and its response time too late. All because while America focused on carriers and tech, China focused on geography and patience. So what should you learn from this? That power in the 21st century isn't about brute military force. It's about invisible control of critical infrastructure. It's about understanding that winning doesn't mean destroying the enemy. It means making it impossible for the enemy to act when the time comes. China doesn't need to defeat the US in combat. It only needs to ensure that when the conflict begins, the US can't reach the battlefield in time. And it's happening now, not in some distant future. Now. Every port built, every loan signed, every diversified security deal, every Huawei cell tower installed. All of it is the architecture of future war being assembled while the world watches Netflix and debates domestic politics. And the scariest part? The window to stop it is closing. Once infrastructure is built, it's permanent. Once economic dependence is established, it's nearly impossible to undo. The United States is starting to wake up. It's opened new embassies, promised $810 million in Pacific aid over the next decade. But compared to the billions China has already invested, too late, too little? The answer will determine who controls the Pacific in the coming decades. And whoever controls the Pacific controls the trade routes that move $7.4 trillion annually, controls access to seabed resources, controls the ability to project military power, controls, ultimately, the balance of power in the 21st century. You'll probably never visit the Solomon Islands, never think about Kiribati, never worry about who built a port in Vanuatu. But when the next global crisis comes, when Taiwan is under threat, when trade routes are cut, when the US discovers it can't move forces because every stopover point was quietly denied, remember this moment. Remember that real power doesn't announce its arrival. It installs itself silently, infrastructure by infrastructure, deal by deal, until control becomes a fait accompli. And remember that while the world debated missiles and tanks, China won a war most people didn't even realize was being fought. If you want to keep understanding the real game being played, the one news outlets don't cover, politicians don't explain, the one shaping the future but happening in the shadows, subscribe now. Because this is the truth no one wants to hear, the uncomfortable truth, the truth that completely changes how you understand the world. China isn't coming, It's already here, and you're discovering it too late to make a difference. The question is, what will you do with this information?